All right, thank you very much. The issue I'm talking to you today about is obviously related to climate change, but it's more specifically looking at the recent effects of coral loss associated with climate-induced coral bleaching. So this is work that's been undertaken by a number of authors, most of whom are within the Centre of Excellence, but also we have a couple of international collaborators. The Centre of Excellence people are named in red and the collaborators from overseas are in black. And the basis of the talk today is really a review we've put together which is currently in press in annual reviews for oceanography and marine biology to be released early next year. So the framework under which I'm going to talk to you today is mostly in the context of what's been happening in the sense of once you lose corals on a reef due to coral bleaching, what happens to the fish. But I'm also going to try and talk more generally about issues that are associated with the loss of biodiversity, and so start touching on aspects such as what are the other motile organisms such as the coral reef invertebrates how are they going to respond to these sorts of disturbances. And to put that into context, the issue is that there's 200,000 species of invertebrates on coral reefs, and that's not including the reef-building corals. So, and yet we know so little about those species. The majority of those aren't even described, let alone really knowing the underlying biology which is going to influence their response to these sorts of disturbances. So the outline of the presentation today is to really look at what's been happening to coral reefs as they've bleached. So we're not forecasting future events. We've already seen major bleaching events around the world, and so we already have hard and fast data showing that when you lose corals on a reef due to coral bleaching or other disturbances, this does have effects on the myriad of other species which live on coral reefs. And so the major effects we're going to be talking about are things like changes in the abundance of species, but also, more importantly, potential species extinctions and the associated loss of biodiversity on coral reefs. And finally, in terms of trying to predict what might happen in the future, I'm going to touch on a little bit of data which looks at which species are the most vulnerable to climate change and specifically coral bleaching, so we can think about what is it we need to know about the myriad of other species which might be able to give us an estimate or a risk assessment on whether they're vulnerable to climate change. So just in terms of a very generalised model of what happens under really severe bleaching events, the first and most important thing which we all think about is the loss of coral cover. And so we've had a number of very severe bleaching events around the world in the last decade where we've lost up to 98% of corals across vast sort of ocean basins. Now, concomitant with this, we also often get a short-lived but somewhat persistent peak in macroalgae. So we see a change in habitats from a coral-dominated habitat to one where coral's obviously much more scarce, and quite often the major dominant benthos on those reefs may be macroalgae. Now you can imagine that this is obviously going to have effects first and foremost for anything that needs coral. And so there are a lot of coral reef species, as you'd imagine, which do need coral. So there's species which depend on coral for food. So if we think about a lot of the butterflyfish, the family Ketodontidae, more than 50% of these species feed on coral as a major component of their diet. And so when you take away the corals, obviously you're taking away their major food source. We've also got a range of other species, such as the coral gobies, which live in an obligate association with live coral. They can't occupy the coral habitat once the coral is actually dead. And more importantly, and probably the new emerging issue, is the fact that corals probably represent a very important recruitment habitat or settlement queue for an even larger range of species. And to really explain what I mean by that is there's a natural dynamic on all reefs where you're going to be losing individuals, and in order to get new individuals to replace those, this is the whole concept of recruitment. Now, recruitment may not happen if those species need to queue in on coral in order to either find the reef or actually instigate a settlement process. So if we think about some of the coral reef invertebrates which rely on coral, we've only really been skimming the surface of this, And we've already revealed there's about 275 species of coral reef invertebrates which are obligately dependent on live corals. So if you had no corals on coral reefs, virtually all these species are likely to disappear. Now you might say, so what? This is a small proportion of the overall diversity on coral reefs. But as we begin to understand more and more about the biology and the habitat associations of the 200,000 odd species, I think you can begin to appreciate that it may be a substantial proportion of species which do need coral. And in this context of coral reef fish, for which we know much more about their resource requirements, it's been already shown, if we break this down, these are various families of coral reef fish. In dark, we look at the number of species which depend on coral for food. In grey, we look at the number of species which depend on coral for habitat. That is, they need live coral as their obligate habitat. And also in white, this might seem like a fairly small proportion at the moment, but I'd imagine this is going to grow. These are the species which need to settle into live coral. Now, combining all these things together, we already know that about 10% of all coral reef fish that live on coral reefs require coral during one or more stages of their life cycle. Now, the most important families which are likely to be affected under a coral loss scenario are first and foremost the butterflyfish family Chaetodontidae, shown by this example in the top picture, for which I've already said a vast majority of species do require live coral as part of their diet. The next group are the Pomacentridae, or the damselfish, as shown here, which essentially most of those rely on that live coral as their obligate home. So you're taking away the essential habitat that they require to persist. And finally, the Gobiidae, the coral gobies, which also have an obligate association in terms of a habitat association. So we already have quite a lot of data which looks at changes in the abundance of these species under various actual bleaching events. So this graph I'm showing at the moment is essentially a meta-analysis or a conglomeration of data from a number of independent studies. So we've been looking at 17 independent studies from various parts of the world, extending from the Great Barrier Reef all the way across the Indian Ocean, looking at what happens when you lose corals due to coral bleaching. And so the 17 studies from which this data was extracted have all documented between a 50 to 80% reduction in live coral associated with a bleaching event. And during those events, you get some fairly general patterns that occur. For example, almost systematically, you lose these species here. So this is the proportional change in abundance of these fish species during a bleaching event. And so a proportional decline of, 100% means that species has actually gone locally extinct in the aftermath of that bleaching event. And so these are means across those 17 studies. So we start to see that you consistently lose these suite of species for which you can look at the colour coding. We're looking at corallivores, the species which need to eat coral. In the red, the coral dwellers, the species that need coral as essential habitat, and also some other species in white for which we don't actually understand the importance of coral at the moment, and this might come back to this whole issue about settlement queues. On the other side, you also see at times a dramatic increase in the abundance of some species. So for example, the herbivores here, shown in yellow, while some of them are affected by coral loss, you quite often see a massive increase in the abundance of these species. But what's probably happening here is they're moving into areas which used to be coral dominated and have switched to a scenario where they're mostly algal dominated. Now if we focus in a bit more closely on what's happening in this data set, there's a couple of species which really jump out as the worst affected in most studies. And by way of example, I'm going to introduce you to these two species. The first one is an obligate coral-feeding butterflyfish, Chaetodon trifacialis, which is quite possibly the most specialised coral reef fish on coral reefs in the sense that it feeds on very few different coral species. So despite thousands of hours of observations working out what this butterflyfish actually eats, we've only ever seen it eat 10 different coral species out of the potential 200-300 that it has in the local vicinity of its habitat. Another example is this species, Gobiidae species A, which is similarly real specialist in terms of its habitat association. So it tends to associate with just one species of Acropora in its geographic range. And when we look at the data on these species, we've shown that if we compare these species to their congenerics, so species within the same genus, this is the percentage decline in abundance of these species under two specific studies which have documented coral depletion. So the first study was conducted on the Great Barrier Reef. The second study looks at habitat-associated gobies in Papua New Guinea. So what I'm showing here, each one of these black dots actually represents one of the coral-feeding butterfly fish. And we have a range from extreme specialists right through to real generalists. So shown here, this is the number of species that we know that these butterfly fish will eat. So in the case of Chaetodon trifacialis, we've only ever seen it eat 8 different coral species. Even more importantly, it takes more than 90% of its bites from just one coral species. That's the tabulate Acropora hyacinthus. And the other extreme, we've got a species up here which eats in the order of 55 different coral species, and it's probably far more than that in terms of being a real generalist. And you can see the specialist species are far more prone to declines in abundance following coral loss, and the same thing here for the habitat-associated gobies. The most specialist species, Gobiodon species A, declined, was virtually went extinct in the local area, whereas there's other species which use a larger number of different corals which had some insurance in the sense that there were other habitats or other resources that they could exploit. So we know that there's an initial effect of coral depletion, but compounding upon this, what often happens during these bleaching events is within sort of 5 to 6 years following a coral bleaching event, you also start to see a fundamental change in coral reef habitats in that you can start to see a decline in habitat complexity. So looking at, if we look to sort of a couple of real case studies in the Seychelles in the Central Indian Ocean, they saw a dramatic decline in habitat complexity where they were witnessing a change from a three-dimensional structure where there's lots of coral, dead corals, but nonetheless coral skeletons in place, to a situation where all those corals collapsed and you had this dead flat plain of rubble. Now this is obviously also going to impact on the species which associate with coral reefs, but I should point out that this decline in habitat complexity isn't a fait accompli. It's not always going to happen, and there's some reefs in which the corals aren't the most important component contributing to habitat complexity. Rather, it's the underlying structure of the matrix, and so we really need to point out that habitat complexity is a really important component of reefs, and we need to understand whether reefs are going to be, specific reefs are vulnerable to a loss of habitat complexity, or that in some situations they may retain habitat complexity despite coral loss. And to really reinforce this, this is data again presented in a different way, where we're actually looking at the change in species richness of coral reef fish. And so we're looking at the whole suite of different studies again, looking at reef by reef sort of situation where we're looking at changes in coral cover compounded by a loss of structural complexity. So these white diamonds, okay, are really a loss of corals, but there was no really detectable change in the habitat complexity or the underlying reef structure. Whereas these black diamonds here, you had the simultaneous loss of coral in the order of 80% coral mortality, which led to a real decline in structural complexity. And when this happens, you can see a real decline in species richness, where you lose up to 30 to 40% of the species in a location. So we can see that there's real ramifications in terms of loss of biodiversity in this system. But I should point out that this loss of biodiversity, the localised loss of species, isn't necessarily a global extinction of species. It's just that that species has disappeared from that particular area. It may exist somewhere else in an area where there was much less impact from coral loss. So when you actually go through and look at the data and look at where the major changes in reef fish abundance and also the diversity of coral reef fish are, following in the aftermath of a bleaching event, within the first year you do see a fairly notable decline in both the abundance of fish on a reef, but also the species richness. And we're looking at less than a 10% change in those metrics. And this, I think, is clear evidence that this is the loss of those species which are directly dependent upon corals, either for food or habitat. But as you progress and you start looking at, the longer term or medium term impacts of a coral bleaching event, we start to see another decline in species richness and abundance about 5 to 6 years after a bleaching event. And so this is a really important result in the sense that previous we thought, well, if it's only the coral-dependent species which are affected, well, they're a minor component of the system. But if we're starting to see impacts across a broad range of species and some real generalist species, then we could have a real problem. Now, you could look at the association here and see that this decline in the fish corresponds with that decline in habitat complexity in terms of the temporal sort of relationship there. So there's really two explanations, however. So the first is, as you move from a system where you've got lots of corals providing real habitat complexity in terms of vertical relief, but also lots of holes which the fish can live in, to a situation where you take away the corals quite often break down due to the natural processes of bioerosion, you end up with a system like this where there's not only very little habitat complexity, but you've got sort of a desert of coral reef habitat in which very few fish really like to live. However, another important effect which might be generating that delayed impact is the importance of corals for recruitment. And this won't initially be manifest because the only time you'll actually see the decline in fish abundance or the disappearance of species is after you see the natural attrition of the adults. So if you're losing adults due to natural attrition but there's no recruitment, no new individuals joining the population, eventually that population is going to decline. Now, we know this is the case for a lot of things like coral-dwelling damselfish. They need the coral habitat as essential recruitment habitat. But what's starting to begin to emerge is they might also be really important recruitment habitats for a range of other species. Species which may not necessarily live in corals throughout their adult lives, but they may be relying on coral either as the settlement queue or they live in that habitat during the very initial stages of their life history. So this has potentially major ramifications, both in terms of the ecology but also the economics of coral reefs. So we've heard these figures before. Currently, the Great Barrier Reef generates in the order of $6 billion per annum, both in terms of tourism and reef fisheries. And so if we start to see declines both in coral-dependent fishes, but also more generally a lot of these commercially important species, then we could see that we're going to have severe ramifications associated with coral bleaching. Now, the news isn't all bad. The situation to date is that we haven't actually documented global extinctions of too many coral reef fish. And now the point to take out of this is that coral reef organisms have generally evolved under fairly extreme disturbance regimes and are mostly very persistent. So if we look at the most specialised species, the ones which we expect are most vulnerable to coral bleaching and the loss of corals around the world, these species, Chaetodon trifacialis and again Gobiodon species A, these species are still with us. We've seen some absolutely phenomenal global scale coral bleaching events, and yes, we've seen dramatic declines in the abundance of these species, but there are still refuges in which these species persist. The only true casualty to date of coral bleaching, the only recorded documented extinction associated solely with coral bleaching, is the Galapagos coral damselfish, which disappeared during the 1998 El Niño event. Now, there's a couple of issues here. The fact that this species disappeared isn't solely attributable to coral bleaching, but there were a number of other sort of issues which made this species particularly vulnerable to extinction. Not only was it really coral dependent, but also it lived in a very small area. As you can imagine from the name, it was only known from the Galapagos Islands, so it had a very small geographic range. Contrast this to the only other species within that genus, which has a much larger geographic range spanning the Panama Canal, we know that this species is persisting on both sides of that Panama Canal. Not only is it persisting, but it's actually increasing in abundance. Now, there's no room for complacency here, obviously, because there are other species which are really potentially on the verge of extinction, in the sense that we've seen real declines in population size, which adds to their susceptibility to extinction, both through reduced population size but also range contraction. So if we think about why it is that these coral reef fishes persist, for the most part, the species we're looking at do have very large geographic ranges, and so this provides insurance. Where you might get coral bleaching in one part of the world, it's not generally having a simultaneous effect globally, at least not in the recent history. And so this species, for example, Chaetodon trifacialis, has one of the largest geographic ranges of coral reef fish. It disappeared from various reefs on the Great Barrier Reef and also from the central Indian Ocean, but there's other regions around the world where these populations are still viable and could potentially lead to the recovery of those species in these other areas. So we really need to develop a framework for assessing the vulnerability of not only coral reef fish but all species to these sorts of large-scale disturbances, especially in the context that climate change and other anthropogenic stresses are all going to have increasingly frequent and severe impacts through time. And so we want to look at what are the basic attributes which predispose species to extinction. And so at the moment we're working with a fairly simplistic model where you've got these various filters of extinction risk. Now at the top of this series of filters, now you could add other layers to this system, we've got the whole concept of ecological versatility, and so that's the concept of whether you're really specialised, you use only a very few number of different resources, or you're really generalist, you can exploit a whole range. Now if you're really specialised, you're going to fall through the holes here, in the sense that specialisation predisposes you to some level of extinction risk. The other really important attribute, as I've touched on, is geographic range. If you've got a very large geographic range, then it's likely that it's in some parts of your geographic range, the disturbance is either going to be not quite as severe or non-existent, and therefore they're the areas in which you persist. But if you're a species with a very small range, for example, the size of the Galapagos Islands, again, you're going to fall through this filter and be much more susceptible to global extinction. And finally, it comes down to population size. So rare species are fundamentally much more prone to extinction than really abundant species. And if we look at things like butterflyfish, on one extreme we've got species which are really, really dominant in the sense that you've got populations which are thousands of individuals per reef. But at the other extreme, we know of some coral reef butterflyfish where the normal population size is in the order of 5 to 10 individuals across an entire reef. So these really rare species are obviously prone to extinction as well. So we can begin to use these various different potential parameters of extinction risk and build up a story as to, which are the most vulnerable species, which are the species we start to have to key in on for our real management attention. And if we do this for coral reef butterflyfish, we've done this now for the 10 major families of coral reef fish. If you look at firstly, the dietary specialists, so in terms of butterflyfish, their main requirement for coral is diet. So if we think about which species use very few corals as opposed to more than 10, we actually only have 5 or so extreme dietary specialists. Fortunately, most of the dietary specialists are really abundant and have very large ranges, such as Chaetodon trifacialis. What we're really interested in is the overlap in this Venn diagram. So which are the species which have the so-called triple jeopardy of extinction risk? Which species are both specialised, have small population size and fairly small geographic ranges? And fortunately, in sense of butterflyfish, there's 0. That's not to say in the geological past there weren't species with that triple jeopardy, but they may have already undergone an extinction filtering. So the only species that really faces the double jeopardy of extinction in terms of restricted range and dietary specialists is actually the most abundant species in the Red Sea. It only eats 2 or 3 different corals, but it's really, really abundant. So fortunately, it doesn't have that triple jeopardy. So in terms of summarising all this, we really need to begin to recognise both live coral cover but also structural complexity, or the underlying habitat quality, so to speak, as distinct and critical components of coral reef habitats. And as I alluded to, there's some reefs which are going to have very high structural complexity despite the loss of live corals. So if you can cast your minds back to the photographs that Ian was showing of Scott Reef, those reefs with very strong vertical relief usually have a lot of swim-throughs, various holes which are created purely by the underlying reef matrix. And so in those particular situations, and that's fairly general of really exposed type reefs, it's not the corals per se which give those environments a high degree of structural complexity, it's really the underlying reef matrix. And that's a real contrast to a lot of reefs, say on the inshore Great Barrier Reef and mid-shelf reefs, where the structural complexity really does come from live coral. And once the coral begins to break down, you really do see a decline in those critical aspects of that habitat. The other important point is that we need to limit anthropogenic stresses on coral reef ecosystems, and especially for species which are going to be vulnerable to coral bleaching. So I mentioned the fact that there's only one species which we really attribute its global extinction to climate change. However, there's a whole suite of species where climate change has contributed to their extinction risk, and these are the species which have been essentially harvested or subject to other degrees of habitat degradation through either coastal land use or pollution. We also need to think about the way that fish respond to the recovery trajectory on coral reefs. And the really important or interesting insight here is that as corals recover, the fish really track that recovery trajectory very well. So there's not really a time lag in the time it takes coral feeding butterflyfish to come back to a reef if you've got coral. So we really do need to facilitate the rapid recovery of coral habitats, both in terms of live coral cover and also the structural complexity in the aftermath of the severe coral bleaching events. And finally, and needless to say, we need to start taking really firm action on things like CO2 emissions, which are going to limit the severity and frequency of these future bleaching events. Thanks very much.